We've now had some time with the newest raid tier, the first tier of the Arcadian raid series, and while there are plenty of people who are still working their way through the tier, there are also plenty who have already beaten M4S, and even more who have at least beaten the first fight, Black Cat, in M1S. And after the discussion we had on this channel about what makes for a good first boss, I felt it only made sense for me to give this encounter a more thorough evaluation and answer the question of how it measures up compared to the rest. And so, that's what we'll do here today. I'm going to go over the areas where I think it shines, where it could have been improved, and in the end, where, if anywhere, it would have landed on my ranking of the best intro bosses in FF14. So for the strengths, let's start off with the obvious parts. We knew from normal mode that the music was great. We knew that the fight had voice acting that added a lot, and not just from the boss herself, but also the announcer. And we knew that these factors, combined with the arena itself being a rather fresh feeling environment, would create an overall aesthetic that would definitely be memorable. And in Savage, we get to feel it even more, in particular because we get to hear more lines from the announcer due to the ways that Savage ramps things up. People falling out of the ring is more common. Deaths in general are more common. Limit breaks are actually going to be used. Yeah, did you ever notice that the announcer has a line for limit breaks? It's actually even in normal mode. It's just not something you'll hear there a whole lot because really, how often are people using the LB in normal mode? These strengths from normal carry over into Savage, and I'm very glad that they do. As for the mechanics and how it teaches them, I actually think this fight is particularly strong. What we in the community call Proteans are used as the very first mechanic, but not just as a cleave that hits everyone at once. They're baited based on proximity, with 4 happening at a time. Now, that does mean that typically you need all 8 players alive and healthy whenever this mechanic happens, but unlike, say, M1S, where that meant if you had any deaths going into them, you're guaranteed to lose more people and quite possibly wipe, the structure here means there are ways to recover. If someone takes a bait they weren't supposed to, or if someone gets clipped by someone else's cleave, you can do things like have a tank invuln potentially, or if you need to sacrifice someone, you can at least make sure that the person being sacrificed is someone whose death won't likely result in a wipe shortly after because the targeting is in the hands of the players. It's very forgiving, very recoverable, and the exact sort of thing I want to see in an introduction to raiding. And this is a pattern we see continue throughout most of the other mechanics. Someone dies to the first clone 1-2 hit, you've got a 50% chance of the follow-up being a very livable light party stack, and even in that other 50% of the time where you get the pair stacks, there's potential for recovery if you mid enough for the solo player to live, at least if their role is chosen to be the targets. And while things get a bit more dicey when that pair or light party stack gets mixed with the Proteans later, even there you have a good chance to recover and aren't too likely to wipe unless things are already very bad. In other words, while this fight does have some of what we call body checks in the community, there aren't so many that they feel overwhelming for a new player, and the ones that are present aren't so punishing so as to be intimidating either. The Mouser phase with the knockups and smashes is also reasonably forgiving. Sure, in the ideal state, you only have enough platforms for the number of players that are going to be hit, but in practice, there's a surprising amount of wiggle room. Even if someone messes up and removes the platform that will be in a quadrant you'll need for the knockback later, in the short term, you likely only have that one player dead, and as long as people can adjust to each other, you can still make the spreads after the knockback work just fine, even with the whole party getting knocked back to the same corner. And that's not where my praise for that phase ends either. It is, what I would say, is the signature mechanic of the fight, the defining moment that makes it stand out, and particularly the second round of it happening, where it's combined with stacks and roll spreads, is at least in competition for being the hardest mechanic in the fight. And here's where I'll draw another comparison, this time to P9S. I really do like that fight, but the limit cut phase is a problem. See, it has the issue I brought up in my top 5 video, where that phase uses none of the prior knowledge from the fight whatsoever. It presents you with a whole new puzzle, to which the only pieces you have are the ones given to you in the moment. not even normal mode has any useful information here. But whether you consider the main wall mechanic in M1S to be quad crossing plus nail chipper or Mouser 2, you have just about all the info you need based on prior mechanics and normal mode going into that hardest mechanic. Now, each one does have one new factor, but in both cases, it's a new factor that takes at most a pull or two to parse and work into your planning. All this to say, I appreciate how this fight goes about teaching new players how it works. Just about all the way through, it's both interesting enough to be engaging, but also forgiving enough to not drive people away. But now I want to take a bit of a step back and just look at all of the things this fight teaches beyond itself. Players are going to come out of this fight familiar with Protean-style cleaves, with light party and pair stacks that can alternate from pull to pull, with basic 2-hit tank busters, generally requiring a tank swap, and with mechanics that are based around the direction that players are facing when they happen. They'll be familiar with needing to mentally move around mechanics so you can figure out where the safe spot will be, through both all of the leaping mechanics as well as the very first 1-2 hit clones. And they'll know to expect mechanics where they're shown something well in advance and expected to remember it for when it resolves later, something that is heavily used, especially throughout the rest of this raid tier. And that's not even all of the transferable skills this fight develops that players will be able to take elsewhere. Now, I wouldn't say it's quite at the level of M1S when it comes to being a 14 mechanics bootcamp, but it's honestly a good bit closer than I expected it to be. Now, before we get more into where I would place it in terms of the best introductions to raiding, I should mention the few flaws that I do see in this encounter, and most of them are in the last couple of minutes. Remember how I said there wasn't a wall mechanic where you don't use any of your previous knowledge from earlier in the fight? Well, that's not 100% true. After Mouser 2, we have Raining Cats, a mechanic where you have 4 rounds of tether hits that happen alongside pairs of stacks, where one stack is baited on the closest player to the boss, while the other is baited on the furthest. But I didn't even know that until more than a week after my first clear. And that's both part of why it's a problem, but also part of why it's not that big of a problem. Let me explain. In my first clear, we didn't really understand what was happening during Raining Cats. It was our first time seeing it, we only had 2 people alive by the end of it, and those 2 people finished the fight. So we never had to learn what it did. And then, by the following week, we were clearing without seeing it at all in my static. We just had the damage to kill her before it even started. And for a lot of groups, they didn't even need to wait for the second week to have that experience. Now, I do want to say with the tuning of this tier being such a discussion point, I don't necessarily think that this fight being easily clearable well before it's in Rage, even in week 1, is an issue. Truthfully, that's pretty normal for the first boss of a tier. Where it's a problem is when it means that mechanics are being skipped that don't occur elsewhere in the fight. And this fight ends in not 1, but 2 such instances. Because what is Raining Cats followed by? Pounce, or Devour, as those of us who've done P5 have been calling it. Another mechanic that doesn't happen at all before that point, and one which a lot of us were expecting after seeing it in normal mode. And since the enrage timer is so forgiving, even groups with less than stellar damage will likely have Black Cat defeated before Pounce even starts. But oddly enough, these problems all kind of balance out into being okay in my mind. It's fine that Raining Cats is kind of a wall mechanic, because it's not too much to ask to have the damage to not see it, and it's also not super complicated as far as walls go. So while it does, in my eyes at least, hurt the overall design of the fight, it's actually fairly minor in how much it does so. So that leaves us with the question of where I would rank this fight as an introduction to raiding. And my answer? It would probably replace Ericthonios as the number 3 slot. Honestly, there's even an argument that it belongs at number 2, right behind Chaos, but I just really value the approaches taken by both Chaos and Eden to make forgiving but interesting puzzles, and I think with the overall approach that Black Cat took, it would have needed to be entirely flawless within that approach to claim that second place slot. And it was close. Honestly, a lot closer than I was expecting it to be after seeing normal mode. And hey, third place is nothing to scoff at. If you haven't ever raided before and are looking for a place to start, I'm very happy to report that if you're level 100, you have a solid choice in trying out the newest raid that we have available. And so, there we have it. Those are my thoughts on Black Cat from M1S. Thanks for watching. If you liked this discussion, please subscribe, as I've got plenty more I'd love to talk about when it comes to raiding in FF14. And with that, I'll see y'all in the next one.